Zach, we are back and we are here to talk about some trading strategies to help you complete more trades in Dynasty Fantasy Football. But before we dive in, the number one trading strategy we have that will help you win all of your trades is to like the video, comment down below what trading strategies are your favorite, what ones did you like today, what ones were maybe new to you that you're going to take going forward, and let other community members know what trades you or what trading strategies you like to implement. But with that said, let's get right to the content you came for. Zach, kick it off with your very first trading strategy that you're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the trade block. A lot of people find this very annoying. I don't care. You know very well, Bob. You're in a couple leagues with me. I use the trade block pretty much every day. And sometimes it's the same player every day. And I don't really care. I feel like you lose opportunities, Bob, to make yourself better, whatever your team trajectory is, by not letting it be known who you want to move off of or who you are interested in. Because the trade block isn't just a place, Bob, where I let you know who's available, but it's a place where I can go to see who else is available. There's another feature, more specifically on Sleeper, where you can literally tell a team you're interested in a player. You just click on the heart, and it sends a message to that team owner that you're interested in that player. I use these features, Bob. Just because someone isn't interested in one of my players today doesn't mean they won't be interested in one of my players tomorrow. If you're trading for a player, especially a vet on a rebuilding team, set your expectation as to what you'll spend on a certain player in these negotiations with your team. That's something I'll talk about later, because sometimes you have to be okay, walking away from a trade. But like I said, we'll talk about that later. I'm a big proponent of using the trade block, of being vocal, being upfront, being in people's face, because there are a lot of teams in a lot of our leagues, Bob, where owners are inactive and there are players and their values dying on their roster. And that is the last thing that I want. And that is the last thing anybody should want. I really feel like it's important, whether you're a rebuilding team and you need to get veterans off your roster, or you're a competing team and you need to go out there and be one of the teams acquiring one of these veteran players from another rebuilding team who's moving off. And for me, that starts with the trade block. That's where I really know, who's available. Because again, I am somebody who believes in having a dialogue for a trade, so I'm not afraid to ask an owner if a player is available. But the trade block just lets me know that these players are available, and I can just start sending offers rapid fire if I need to. So again, I'm very present. I'm upfront about it. I'm annoying sometimes, but I'm very much a believer in letting everybody know who's available on the trade block as much as I desire, until I get a deal done.
When the trade block is used correctly, and because I've seen it in some leagues where people will just spam trade block and put everybody up on the roster every other day, whatever the case is, onto the trade block. But when it's used right, and when you're actually just trying to make a move or two, and you're putting up a player that, hey, this season hasn't gone correctly for me, like you did a couple weeks ago with Jonathan Taylor. You started putting him up on the block when you kind of decided to maybe start shifting gears towards next year. You put up Jonathan Taylor right before he was about to come back. His value was about to peak, and that kind of got conversation started. Now you haven't made a deal, but that utilization of the trade block got conversation started. And if you wouldn't have done that, who knows that you want to move off of Jonathan Taylor? Why would anybody, in all honesty, outside of unless they're telling you, I couldn't really assume that somebody, this guy probably wants to move off JT because it's Wednesday, so he probably hates him today. I don't know what the case is, but it's a great way, like you said, to just communicate with your league, and also just not one player in the league, but the entire league. And if you are kind of like me, where I have an internal struggle with the trade block, because I do feel for some people, some players in Dynasty, when you put somebody on the trade block, it says, come get this guy for cheap. And I have an issue with that. And that's where, if you're not going to use a trade block, an alternative method is to just be very adamant about reaching out to other people in your league via DM. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe sending a trade offer first and kind of not necessarily including that player you're trying to move. Try to kind of work your way towards that conversation of, let's say you're trying to get Jalen Waddle, you're trying to move JT, whatever the case is. Maybe you don't start by moving JT to get Jalen Waddle. Maybe you work your way there, like kicking and screaming, oh, darn, you got me to move JT for Jalen Waddle in some sort of package. But either which way, I like this a lot. Just finding ways or using the tools you have at your disposal to facilitate trades, to help get trades done, to kind of get that conversation started at worst. And even though go back and put them up almost every single day, it gets a conversation started almost every single day. So you're doing exactly what you want with it. Some may consider it annoying, but until it's proven wrong that it doesn't get conversation started, I can't say boo about it.
Yeah, the other thing that it does, Bob, is sometimes even though it's people make a joke about it, it gets the league going sometimes because like,
Right.
oh, here's another like I think it was in our Rewinders league where it's like, oh, he hasn't posted JT yet, so
Yeah.
then I posted JT.
Yeah. Shout out
It's
Noah.
a way to get that league engagement going, and sometimes that will get somebody in the league chat, and you'll see that somebody's in the league chat, and you can start that dialogue with them. So it's just another way to kind of see who's there, see who's present and engaging to start a dialogue somehow, some way.
Exactly. And league activity is huge too. Finding ways to keep your league active and, keeping on top of the league itself and the members in it. That makes Dynasty that much more fun. That makes trades like these that we're talking about in other videos. We're talking strategies today, I guess, but having active leagues is what makes trades happen. Other things that can make trades happen or maybe not happen in this case, my strategy is make trades that make sense for your team. Now, I've seen too many teams over the years make boneheaded moves for players that they just have no business dealing for. I brought up to you that a team that is 1-6, probably going to be 1-7 after this week, traded their first round pick for Cooper Kupp. And it's looking like a top 5 pick. It's max points for in the league determination of draft order. So it's looking like a top 5 pick, but it's just one of those moves. Like, why do you make that type of move? If you're a competitive team, you shouldn't be moving your assets, your more competitive pieces for youthful assets or draft capital that aren't scoring you points right now. If you're a competitive team, you need depth, and you shouldn't necessarily be spending that depth on players that aren't going to or may not reliably score you points on your roster. And just like if you're that team that should be looking to rebuild, moving your first round pick for Cooper Kupp, just not the move. If you're a competitive team or that first was late, even, I'm kind of about it. If you're trying to shake things up and try to turn to be more competitive this year, I still don't love it, but at least the concept of value is still intact, at least in that case. But either which way, it's so important. One of the things that I've always felt when my teams are really doing well is when the moves correlate with the trajectory of my team or what team mode I'm in, whether I'm rebuilding or whether I'm competing. The trades I'm making fit that mold. And that's when I feel like my teams are doing the absolute best, whether I'm rebuilding and trying to tank for picks, whatever the case is, or if I'm competing and I'm trying to win a championship and I'm not shoveling off competitive pieces for younger assets just because they may or may not score me points the rest of the year. As we like to talk about romanticizing the dynasty aspect of things and building for forever, make trades that make sense for your team, know where your team is at, knowing where your team is at realistically. We talked about it last week, knowing when to hold them, when to fold them, when to look to next year, when to push this year. If you're that fraudulent team, maybe you don't make that competitive trade. If you are a competitive team, make that competitive trade. If you're a rebuilding team, stick to the trades that make sense for you. Don't trade for vets. Don't trade for players that just aren't going to outlast the rebuild. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this point, or feel free to continue on into your next one.
I just want to make sure that when we say don't, if you're a rebuilding team, you shouldn't be adding veterans. This is via trade, right? If there are veterans
Sure.
to be added via waiver wire, very smart to do so. Like I have a lot of shares of Royce Freeman right now,
Sure.
Darrell Henderson right now, and these are players that are not helping me in a rebuild. But the last 2 weeks, Royce Freeman and Darrell Henderson have each scored a touchdown. So there's going to be some owner who's going to need a running back at some point, and I can maximize the value of that. So again, it's that is, I just want to make sure that we clarify that because you still want to be adding vets, but you don't want to be trading for them.
Right. And I would say that there is an argument to be made that you've brought up in the past already of trading for, injured vets. If you're looking to possibly come out of your rebuild next year, a guy like Nick Chubb this year, a guy like Cooper Kupp last year, there's some cases to be made there. Now, do I necessarily want to throw draft capital into Nick Chubb? Not necessarily, but there could be situations where I do feel it. If I feel like I'm getting a good trade pick offer, maybe I do make that move. It's just one of those things. It's not necessarily great to rule them out entirely, but don't trade for vets that aren't going to outlast a long-term rebuild. Especially don't trade for them, like you said, but don't trade for vets that aren't going to outlast the rebuild. And a great trading strategy is to know when to move on from guys like you mentioned. If you had them on your roster just by luck of the draw somehow, I guess, I don't think anybody, man, if you had those players on your roster still after everything they've been through, good on you guys. I applaud you. But knowing when to move on from those guys, just as much need to know. Something else you need to know is Zach's next point. What do you got here?
This next point, Bob, requires a little bit of homework and a little bit of knowledge of your league mates, because this is not something you can just willy-nilly implement as you want. You literally have to open up your entire league's roster and look at positions. Sometimes you even have to go team by team and say, oh, like they have a good example. We're recording this after the Kirk Cousins injury. Who needs a quarterback right now? I just picked up, throw somebody's name in here that you want, whatever. I can trade this quarterback to this player because I don't need this player. So you have to look throughout your league and see who needs players or who needs positions that you're trying to move off of, right? I don't really blindly send out trades to all 11 teams. My way of doing trades for the most part, especially on rebuilding teams, is identify teams that have needs and start a dialogue with an owner who needs what you have to offer, see if you can get the ball rolling on a deal. I really do preach this, and I think it's really important. I'm not one of these people, and I get into a lot of orphan leagues, and if I'm in an orphan league that doesn't have a lot of activity, I'll let it be known in the league chat. And they're like, well, why aren't you sending out offers? Like, that's not how I operate. Like, I want to make sure I'm not wasting anybody's time, and I'm sending somebody an offer of players or positions that they want. So I'm somebody that really believes in having a dialogue. But sometimes to do that, you have to do that extra work of looking at rosters around your league. And whether it's a rebuilding team or whether you're a rebuilding team, do I have something that they need, or do they have something that I need? And can we get this conversation going? It's very difficult sometimes to get trades going. Just, if somebody posts somebody on the trade block, so to say, and you don't have that dialogue and just send an offer, sometimes it's an instant reject. Whereas if you have that dialogue, Bob, and say, hey, listen, I see that, you're not really competing this year. I get ripped in the comments for this all the time, because sometimes it sounds like I'm bullying people, right? We're like, no, I'm enlightening you. You're not competing this year. Let's open up the max PF and see where you're at, So yeah, sometimes, Bob, it's just having that dialogue, but doing that extra homework of seeing who has a need, who can fill a need that I have, and getting that trade going, because trades have to make sense for both parties, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times you get offers, I get offers, and it's like, and I'm somebody that will, again, engage that dialogue of, why are you sending me this? Explain your rationale for sending me this trade. I'm a big believer in having the dialogue. And to me, it's a very important aspect of trading, because not only does it, like, if you get a trade done via dialogue, Bob, it really sets you in a good position with that owner moving forward too. Because
Sure.
They saw how reasonable you were. They saw how logical you were in the thought process. And a lot of times, that's somebody I will go back to again when I need, and I know that they will have this engaging dialogue. So a lot of times people don't want to put this homework in, and I understand that. And that's just, to me, the difference between, being really invested in Dynasty, where a lot of people are like, oh, this is just for fun. And I'm like, no. This is we are here, Bob. We are watching this channel. We are in the Discord. We are a Patreon member because we love Dynasty fantasy football, but we are hardcore people here, and so I'm here for the dialogue.
All of your point boils right into mine, so I'm just going to kick it right off this. What you're talking about is finding ways to create and utilize leverage. Basically, where can you find leverage or situations that incentivize managers to make deals with you? Whether it's working off areas of your own strength towards areas of your opponent's weaknesses or your league mates' weaknesses. One thing I think to just erase from your mindset is feeling like you're against the person you're trying to trade with. Everybody in the comments, and there'll be people in this video who ask in the comments, rate this trade, did I win? Don't worry about winning the trade. We'll talk about that next week. And I'll say the same dang thing, but you're trying to work with this other manager to get a deal done that helps both of you. Like you said, you need to help both parties. Otherwise, you're just never going to get a trade done. And if you have trouble getting trades done, either you're in a league that just doesn't trade very much, or you're working with a lot of managers that don't value players properly or send very good trades, or you, the person watching, are the one sending the bad trades. So you need to work off these areas of leverage, see what players you have that may be excess, or like I said, working off areas of strength that could help the weaknesses. We just talked about it. We possibly lost Kirk Cousins for the season. We don't have confirmation of an Achilles injury yet. Just it is an Achilles injury. That's the belief, but we don't have confirmation of a tear yet that he's going to miss the season. But who can you go to in the league that now lost Kirk Cousins for the season, and you have an extra quarterback kicking around that you can send them in some sort of deal, whatever the case is? Or same thing when an elite player like Justin Jefferson goes down and goes to IR. What players can you send to that team especially if you're a rebuilding team trying to unload points? Who can you kind of send along, be that pharmacy like we discussed a couple weeks back now, that can kind of mend the wounds of these teams that are just hurting? Where can you find these areas that just help you get deals done? Work off these areas of leverage, work off of whatever the case may be. How can you help the person you're trading with? And then how can they help you in other ways from what you're trying to get from them? Because if they're hurting at wide receiver and you're hurting at wide receiver, they're probably not going to trade you a wide receiver at any good value. But if they're hurting at wide receiver and you're good at wide receiver, but you're hurting at running back, they're good at running back, you might be able to do a nice positional swap there. Now, how the values shake out is different. That depends on the players involved. But at the end of the day, you have to find these leverage spots, these areas that you can work off of to get deals done. Because, at the end of the day, the more leverage you can work with, the more you're going to actually be able to get deals done, the more deals that are going to kind of favor you, especially in the moment. If you can help out whoever has Kirk Cousins that just lost him for the season, if you have a Dak Prescott kicking around that you can send their way to kind of fill that gap for now, and you don't necessarily need them, that's a thought to be had and thought worth having. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this point. If you have anything to add, other areas that you can kind of create leverage or use leverage.
Yeah, Bob, sometimes leverage comes in different forms, right? For me, like I talked about in my previous point, I get into that dialogue and I start pointing things out. Like, hey, man, you are bottom 3 in max PF. Maybe it's time to think about next year. Sometimes leverage is
Love that.
Sometimes leverage is, let's say you're trying to make a trade with a rebuilding team, right? And they're clearly going in for next year, trying to prioritize their first round pick being high. And another rebuilding team makes a trade. You now have leverage to go to that owner and say, that guy just made his team worse. That's a situation where there's not obvious leverage, but there is that leverage that you can turn into an advantage for you. Say, hey, that guy just moved off Isaiah Pacheco and Jerry Jeudy. He's getting points off his roster, and he's only 30 points behind you in max PF. What are you going to do about it? So leverage comes in different forms here. I love this point, Bob, but we got to think about leverage not only in terms of like, hey, I have a wide receiver that you need, you have a bye week, you have injury. And I'm not saying that that's what you're saying. Right. I'm saying that that's the surface level that sometimes dynasty owners think about when there are very different layers to creating leverage in dynasty fantasy football.
Yeah, I think you make a great point of putting situations into context of what just happened, how that affects that team, and why that, almost incentivizing them with good reason, not just saying like, oh man, you should trade me Justin Jefferson because he sucks. That's not how you go into somebody's DMs or anything like that. Another way that I just happen to think of, keeping past trade offers in mind. Somebody, if they, had interest in a player in the past, that's another way you can kind of keep that in the back of your mind and utilize that down the road when you want to make another offer. Maybe something else comes up where you just have a different offer to make. I like that you put into the thought of thinking about next year as well. If they're a bad team, or maybe they're a team that wasn't expecting to be competitive, and now you have competitive pieces to ship off because you're deciding to look to next year. I love the concept of putting situations that team that you're trying to trade with could be going through, and work off of that to further initiate more leverage and just finding a ton of ways. I'd love to hear how you guys initiate more leverage too. I think there's a ton of ways that we're just not bringing up right this second. I'd love to hear that in the comments. Please drop that below. If you know what we're talking about, I want to hear from you. Zach, go ahead, dive on into your next point while everybody's typing away in the comments, letting us know how they implement leverage in their leagues. What do you got, Zach?
Yeah, you talked about this earlier, Bob, and I was hoping you didn't spoil my point here, but probably one of my bigger trademarks is buying value dips. We've talked about my dynasty strategy before. I'm not the big risk taker, But this is where I will take risks because these are calculated and these are minimized risks most of the time. This will not always work. Okay. This will not always work. If you hit 50% of the time on value dips, you're doing good. But I like to buy slow performing rookies or injured players, depending on team situations, team dynamics, so on and so forth. But I believe that those are great ways, Bob, to potentially buy players at values you normally wouldn't or shouldn't be able to, depending on injury or rookie situations. Like I said, these are calculated risk, but I prefer these risks versus big ticket items. I don't like buying, the Austin Ecklers and the Jamar Chases of the world. And look, I know that a lot of times they work, but a lot of times it costs you a lot to give up. And situations change, dynamics change in those. I'm talking about buying Amon-Ra St. Brown before his big rookie breakout for 2 fourth-round picks. I did trade for Puka Nacua a lot prior to the season. This wasn't any kind of rookie dip, but, rookie drafts happen in May, and we get to rookie fatigue by the time it's August, September, So I'm a big believer in buying value dips, whether that's injury dips, whether that's rookies underperforming. Those are the risks I like to take in Dynasty Fantasy Football. And I think it's a really great way, Bob, to, for the most part, just buy low on players that you wouldn't typically be able to. Like, you could have bought a lot of Breece Hall, a lot in January, February, March. People didn't know when he was coming back. There was talk about the Jets signing another running back. Do they draft one in the draft? And look, it's Breece Hall is still being Breece Hall. So even on a terrible offense with Zach Wilson, Breece Hall is still giving you comparable fantasy numbers and sometimes, top 15 running back numbers for your dynasty teams. So I'm a big believer in buying injury dips, buying underperforming rookies in context to situations that make sense, right? Like I'm not buying an injured player unless it fits my timeline of competing, whether that's a year or two away from now. I give the example of I bought Cooper Kupp last year on a team that was going all in 2023. I'm not buying Cooper Kupp if I'm 0-7 right now, and it doesn't really look like I have a super competitive window for 2024. So, you have to, and we've talked about this in our rebuilding videos. We've talked about this in some of our other videos, like knowing your team dynamic, knowing when your window is, so on and so forth. So I think this is a great way to, if you're a rebuilding team, put yourself in that championship window. And if you're a competing team, maybe you can buy low on a rookie, because a lot of times if you're a competing team, Bob, you have one of those late first round picks. You can't really get the rookies you wanted to get. For example, you probably could have bought JSN the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season for lower than what you should have been able to in certain situations. So those owners that get rookie fatigue and want to move on, I try to capitalize on those situations.
Yeah, I think this boils down to 100%. Anytime that you can buy a player for less than what they should be, less than what market value suggests, do it. Especially when you believe in that player. With a lot of these players, I'm interested because I believed in the prospect. I believed in the player, especially when we're talking about younger players that just haven't broken out yet. I believe in the player enough. I believe in the situation enough. And I have reason to believe that this player is going to start doing more in this offense. JSN, a great reason why, there was about 1 week before his blow up last week where his snap percentage ticked up, and then DK Metcalf was going to miss some time. Had a really nice game the last 2 weeks now. So that window is probably still lower than what I think it'll be a year from now. I think there's still going to be some growth production wise. It's going to bump up his value that much more. I still believe in him as that much of a skilled prospect. When you can learn to utilize not only buy windows, when you can buy value dips, when you can sell high on players that are performing, whether it's above whatever they're doing, prime example, like we've already kind of talked about, selling high, quote unquote, on a Darrell Henderson or a Royce Freeman, who were players that were worth nothing at the start of the season. Now you might be able to get a 3rd or 4th round pick for. If you don't need them on your roster, that's selling high. Now you're not selling for a big ticket item by any stretch of the imagination, or you shouldn't be, but you're still selling high to what that player's worth is. And when you can, kind of find avenues to do both of these things, especially when you don't need that player on your roster, you're selling high on, or that you're buying low on and you can't deal with the production dip like we've discussed on the channel previously. When you can learn how to know when to buy low and when to sell high, man, that opens up a lot for you and what you can do in Dynasty. You need to follow along, or, find your own way to read the tea leaves, knowing how to look at advanced analytics and things like that, or even just, as simple as seeing snap shares increase. Like I discussed with JSN, his snap share went up 20% without anybody else dipping, either Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. JSN just got more into the game. It's just one of those things that just one of the small metrics. There's plenty of other big ones that you can look at too, but that's a discussion for another day. I'm sure we'll have some sort of breakout strategy video on how to digest breakouts. But one of the very first things I talked about with you when you came onto this channel was talking trading strategies and how I like to chase a plus return on assets in trades whenever I can. Now, what that means is I'm getting more assets in return than what I'm sending. I like to get 3 if I'm sending 2. I like to get 4 if I'm sending 3. I like to get 2 if I'm sending 1. Now, this obviously can't always happen because at some point, more than likely, if you're competing, you're going to be making more of those tier up trades where you're going 2 for 1. But in the process leading up to that, I'm always going to be an advocate of building your asset pool, even in a competitive state, not always doing tier up trades. But and when I say assets, I'm talking about players and draft capital primarily. I'm not really talking about fab. I'm not the fab guy here. That's not my thing. I'm not a big fab guy. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, draft capital is a universal currency that everybody loves. Not everybody loves every player, but everybody will love draft capital, whether they want to admit it or not. They love draft capital. So why not get as much of it as you can? It opens up opportunities and adds flexibility to the moves you can make. I've been in situations where I just don't have a lot of draft capital kicking around rosters, and it's really hard to try to get a trade done because I want to move X player, but I want to go get this player. I can't get them because I don't have any other draft capital or players that I don't need to facilitate that trade one way or another. So having draft capital just opens up a bunch of flexibility. And when you're trying to compete, especially, or even rebuilding, one of the nice things we talk about in our roster reviews when we're talking about rebuilds, having assets gives you so much flexibility on what you can do, and that's almost scary. But when you can build up an asset pool to start with, and that doesn't mean you end up drafting all the players you have, but when you can build up that asset pool, it gives you a ton of flexibility. How to implement, real simple. Once you're close on a trade, whenever you're almost ready to hit accept, ask for that extra pick or prospect back. Ask for that player that they might have in the trade block that's an underperforming rookie that, you're not getting JSN back in most deals as an add-on later in the deal. You're getting second-round picks, third-round picks, Jaden Reeds, Rashee Rice, Josh Downs type of players, maybe, but ask for that extra piece back. As you have said and used to say on this channel quite a bit, squeeze the juice from the orange as much as you can and just get every little extra bit as you can. I'll touch on this even more with my next point, but Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is one that you kind of bestowed right upon me, one that I implement now. And I think this is such a phenomenal one, especially if you are, I don't want to say like drafting late is a skill, but it takes a certain mindset to enjoy drafting third, fourth, fifth rounds. And you have to realize that you're not supposed to build the crux of your team on those kinds of draft picks. But, if you've got, throw any number out there, 5, 6, 7 draft picks, and one of those hits, and I mean hits, like not like Michael Wilson hits, but a very meaningful player. Last year it was Isaiah Pacheco. This year it was Puka Nacua. If you've got those guys, you now have a first round quality caliber player on your team. And so getting that extra asset in those trades, and sometimes it really doesn't take very much. It's just like you said, just asking for it. A lot of times in sales, people are just afraid to ask for the sale, ask for the money. It's the same thing in trades. Ask for that extra pick. What's the worst that comes of it? No. Okay, let's go back to the other trade that we had. But you can really try and finagle an extra asset, like you're saying there, Bob, by just asking for it sometimes, because a lot of times people do not value third and fourth round picks as much as somebody like you or I do. Even if I don't trade those for a player, right? The only way I'll do an in draft trade for a third round pick is you give me a second round pick next year. So if at the very least I can flip that pick to a better pick in the future, if not a dart throw player that I'm excited for during the draft. So I really like this point. Believe in it. Subscribe to it. I'm a Patreon member to that point that you brought up, Bob. And it's one that's helped me acquire a lot of players later in drafts I would not have been able to acquire without that knowledge of asking for that pick.
Another thing, you should subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I hope all of you have. If not, here's your sign from above or the channel that you're watching. But with that said, Zach, before we get emotional about these things, why don't we talk about this next point? I love this point. Speaking of emotions, let's talk about them. Let's talk about our feelings, Zach. What do we got with this one?
Yes, when it comes to trading, don't be emotional. This is a business decision, all right? My favorite part about this is a lot of people say don't use trade calculators. I'm a huge fan of trade calculators because they give me a baseline of a trade and where it should be. And a lot of times what happens is dynasty players get emotional about a player. They like this player, they like this situation, and they send out an offer that's not good business. It's not a good move for them. Or they'll accept a trade that is not good for them in terms of their long-term dynasty outlook. So do not be emotional about trading in dynasty fantasy football. I'm all about having players on your squad that you generally like, Bob. You know this. I like players. I like Jonathan Mingo. I like Michael Wilson. I have a lot of shares of those players. But we can't ignore the basics when making trades like team trajectory, league settings, et cetera, et cetera. It gets easy to talk yourself into a player by looking up their name on Twitter and seeing all the positive posts. I do this all the time. Sometimes, Bob, you have to be okay walking away from a deal without getting it done. And sometimes that puts the pressure on the other owner. They're like, oh, whoa, this guy's really like, he's going to walk away. Let's go back to the table and maybe I'll entertain what he's saying a little bit more. So don't be emotional. Don't make trades based off emotion. Sometimes you have to go to your peers. Sometimes I go to Bob all the time for trades. I go to our Discord members and ask, hey, I'm really liking this trade. What do you guys think? And see if somebody talks me out of it or see if somebody else presents a point of view that I'm not looking at. So it's hard to get out of if you're an emotional trader. It's hard to get out of because that's just that's more than a dynasty thing. That is a life perspective thing, right? On how they approach different things in their lives. So when we get to this dynasty fantasy football aspect where, we are playing for pride. Some people are playing for money. We can't be in situations, Bob, where we are so in love with players where we are offering double the value for a player, or in a situation, I would even peel this back to another situation where I'm a rebuilding team, Bob, and I'm accepting less than what I should be getting. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's like, do not be emotional, be practical about this. Sometimes if this is something you struggle with, this is where it's great to have that community to rely on. We have that in our Discord. We have that in our, you see our comment section sometimes. And even if you just have that go-to person, we're like, hey man, am I seeing this wrong? Like, what are you seeing here? Let me know. But if you are an emotional trader, this can cost you. This can make your 1 year rebuild into a 2 year rebuild. This can make your championship window and put you in a situation where now you're a team in the middle of the pack. So ask yourself, are you an emotional trader? Or ask your community, your dynasty community, are you an emotional trader? Send them trades you've done. Send them trades you've offered and see if we can correct that action, because this will kill you in dynasty fantasy football.
Love this point. I think having a third-party perspective is huge. And that's why trade calculators, I don't ever suggest to live and die by a trade calculator. I'd say play around with them, find one you like. That's cool. Don't live and die by it. They're not a Bible. They're more of a guideline to see, especially if you just put in a player, see where they're at. And maybe their valuation is way off from what you have, good or bad. Who knows? And then maybe you just have to, it's a good way to, like you said, kind of reel you back in, maybe make you more excited about a player, whatever the case is. And I think just being too emotional about a player you really like, you put too high of expectations on a player too early, whether it's a rookie, whatever the case is. Then you get down and out about a player. And then maybe you sell low. Like you kind of said, the note I had here, I circled it, pinned it on my notepad. You should circle it as well. Being emotional about trades is a great way to overpay and a great way to undersell. Because if you're pissed off about whoever Deontay Johnson got injured twice in today's game. He was having a fine game, and I'm just sick of his injuries and all his nonsense. And I was like, man, what can I do to get any Deontay Johnson share off my roster? And now I'm a few hours away from the game, and I'm like, okay, I still like Deontay Johnson, still have high hopes, but it's one of those things. If you are emotional, find a way to take a step back, find ways to look at other resources. Like Zach, you mentioned our community Discord. There's other Discords out there too. You don't have to join ours. There's plenty of other ones out there. There's free ones out there too. I'm not going to act like there aren't. There's some out there. I don't know who they are. I apologize, but ours is through patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Link is in the description box below.
Yeah, I do agree with you. The trade calculators, they're not the end all be all. I do like to stick with DLF because that's the one we use on our podcast as well when we're talking about determining values, buy, sell, so on and so forth. And I like to keep it consistent, but it is a guideline. It is a guideline, and it's not meant to be the end all be all. So I agree with that point.
Good deal. Moving on up to my next point. Strategy I call the method of rounding up. And no, I'm not talking fractions or decimals or anything like that, any of that nonsense. If you can't snag a plus asset in return, something I like to do, when I'm wheeling and dealing, going back and forth with trade offers, can I move a draft pick a round up? Can I go from a fifth to a fourth? Can I add that little bit of a value swing in a deal where I'm close to hitting accept? Can I send a fifth to get a fourth, or fourth to get a third to get a second to even possibly get a first? Any draft or any trade scenario I'm looking at, if I'm close on a deal, if I can't snag a straight up plus asset, can I improve one? Because in my opinion, improved assets are plus assets too. Because you're improving a draft pick by an entire round, and now that round might not shake out to be an entire round. One thing you can look to do is if you're moving a third, does that team have that corresponding team second? Then you can guarantee yourself a full round of picks upgraded. Not always possible. I hope that made sense. I kind of ran through it. I think it did in my head, but this is simple. When you're looking at deals, you want to get a little more value. Maybe you can't get away with just adding that second round pick. Maybe you got to throw a third back. You're still upgrading a pick. You need to think about it like that. You're moving that pick, possibly a full round. You can move that pick up, possibly 24 picks. Depends on where the picks shake out, so on and so forth. But Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. This is pretty simple. This is nothing crazy. This isn't rocket science by any stretch. It's the method of rounding up. We learned that back in grade school. This you don't need a PhD for. Zach, what do you got on this point, if anything to add? Otherwise, feel free to dive on into your next point.
Yeah, it's just like you said, this is a way. Sometimes you cannot squeeze that extra asset out of that trade. Right. So this is a way to, okay, well, if you won't give me the extra fourth, how about you give me third and I'll give you a fourth? And sometimes that even takes some more dialogue, like I said earlier, where you have to present, hey, this is a late third and mine is an early fourth. So,
Sure.
Really this is a 5 or 6 round pick jump at max. And then you start like brown nosing, like, oh, maybe that's 312 and I'm 401, ha ha ha. Right. Something like where you try to just smooth over the process of getting it done. But yeah, this is something you do. This is like the break glass in case of emergency type situation.
And the last thing I'll add on this, the last thing I'll say is this. Imagine if every other deal you made, you were able to add an additional draft pick, and then the following corresponding move, you upgraded that draft pick in another trade. Just imagine the wheelhouse of value you're just cranking out with your roster. That's not going to be perfect. That's not going to happen every time. That's unrealistic to expect. But with that kind of mindset where you're looking for these things, you're just going to be that much more likely to find the ways to add value to your roster, value scout, as we like to say. And if you can make your draft capital better and more valuable, a 2 is more valuable than a 3. Even before draft picks are laid out, the 212 is more valuable than 301. I don't care what anybody says. It works with the 112 and the 201 too. Just keep that in mind. Something to think about. Something to think about is your next strategy, Zach. I want to hear about it. I want to hear all about it. What do you got? This is a great one. I love this point.
This one's definitely more for the rebuilding teams here, Bob, but it's not selling a player just to sell. I think a lot of times, and this is something I've talked about, getting points off your team, but there's a process to this. A lot of times I see players get moved just to get the points off of their rosters and acquire whatever the market will give them at given times. But the market is ever changing. A lot of situations happen where, if I told you a month ago that Amari DiMarcado and Royce Freeman hasn't scored a touchdown in 4 years, Bob, and scored a touchdown the day we're recording this video. Darrell Henderson. These are players getting meaningful snaps. If I told you that a month ago, you're laughing in my face. You are laughing in my face because you don't even know who Amari DiMarcado is. I don't even know if I'm saying his name. I don't even know if I'm saying his name right though. And I know you do because you're the scouting guy. But he was a rookie last year. He's a rookie this year at TCU last year. But you get my point. Yeah. The market is a very changing place. So this is a quick way to lose value and also tip the league market, right? In the future. I'm going to give you an example here. I had a league where there's a team and he's very, like, this was a first year league. And in the startup draft, he acquired 2 or 3 first round picks. And he's been making moves the entire year to just acquire future draft capital. And he traded, and I'm going to give you this list of players and I'll tell you what he got for it. He traded Brian Hoyer, Ezekiel Elliott, Kareem Hunt, Elijah Mitchell, and Jalen Warren for a 2024 third round pick. You don't even need to process the names on that list. Now, this caused a lot of uproar in the league because you are very much tipping the scale here for one team by giving them all these players for a single third round pick. Not only that, you now change the market for everybody else. This caused a lot of uproar in the league. And look, this kind of trade is not happening in a lot of places, but you get the principle that I'm talking about with this trade, where it's like, oh, I've got to get rid of this player. A really good one right now, a good example, this is Gardner Minshew right now. I have Gardner Minshew in a lot of places, especially wherever I had Anthony Richardson. And I'm going to be straight up honest with you. We have a Rewinders Crew League, and I got an offer. I won't say from who. I got an offer for Gardner Minshew for third round pick. And I'm like, no, because the numbers he's putting up right now are, and this is a super flex league. I mean, these are quarterback one numbers. I think he had 30 points last week. I think he had 18 points this week. I can't remember the specific league scoring settings, but these are QB1 numbers. Now, I'm not expecting a first round pick, but I'm not going to give away a quarterback that I can just keep on my roster, and he'll be a backup quarterback wherever he goes. And he's a very suitable backup quarterback. That's a quarterback I can keep. What's a third round pick? A dart throw? I'd rather have a backup quarterback that when he starts is borderline top 15, top 20 quarterback. So there are situations where you don't have to trade players. And those situations for me are typically when I'm getting, 75 cents on the dollar. Just because I'm in a rebuilding situation doesn't mean I'm going to sell for much less than what I should. If you want to buy my player, you got to give me adequate value. And this is, again, where I've talked about this before. You have to be okay walking away. And sometimes that's hard because on paper, that trade fits the criteria of what we're talking about. It's getting points off my roster. It's making my first round pick better, and I'm acquiring another draft pick. But at the same time, I'm making somebody else better. And how much better did I get? Again, the chances of hitting on a third or fourth round pick are very few and far between. In a super flex league, a quarterback holds more value than that, especially one like Gardner Minshew is probably one of the better backup quarterbacks in the league. And if he doesn't hold value to me, he will hold value to whatever team he goes to. Like if he goes to Arizona next year and backs up Kyler Murray, I can then trade Gardner Minshew to the Kyler Murray owner, and that will provide value to that owner. So this is a situation where you can't just take any deal that's offered. You have to be a little bit smarter about it, and make sure that while you are in a rebuild, like you don't just make these moves to make these moves. Because in that trade that I provided you, you can get a third round pick for Kareem Hunt alone right now. And that doesn't mention Jalen Warren. What if Ramondre Stevenson goes down? Then Ezekiel Elliott is worth a lot. What if CMC goes down? Then Elijah Mitchell is worth that. So there are 3 or 4 potential third round picks on this trade alone if you're just patient about it and let the market dictate different values that are moving in different directions every single week, as opposed to, I just need to get all these players off my roster. Let me take 1 third round pick. You lose a lot of value that way, Bob.
I definitely understand the incentive to move off players, especially like you said, in this instance, for a rebuild. And I'd say even, just to pile onto this point a little bit, just not in the pure vein of not selling a player just to sell for whatever the reason, you just want to move on. The unsexy names that people were trying to move off of earlier in the season that they probably still are, the Antonio Gibsons of the world. This is one prime example I always bring up, is if you can't get the peak value of what Antonio Gibson should be worth in terms of quality, I try to chase that in terms of quantity. So instead of getting a single third round pick that, especially from a team that's likely buying, in your case, Gardner Minshew, or if you're trying to buy Antonio Gibson, you're probably a competitive team. That third round pick, if it's that team's, is probably looking later, which is also not great value. Can you get that third round pick and an additional third round pick in 2025, or an additional third round pick? Maybe they have another third round pick that year as well. Can you chase similar value in less quote unquote damaging or sexy value images to that team that just don't feel like as much of a hit? Can you move off of, or get them to move off of, those two assets that kind of equate the one quality asset you're kind of getting, the one that if you were to combine these two assets to try to trade for the one you're actually want, does that match up? That's kind of what I'm trying to do with players that you're just trying to sell. Try to find other ways to get the quantity of value that leads to the eventual quality that you want. That's what I want to do when I'm just trying to sell a player, just trying to move off of, for whatever reason, whether it's a rebuild, whether I just want to be done with a player. Selling low, the number one biggest mistake, and we'll talk about this next week, spoiler alert, one of the biggest mistakes you can make trading is just pissing value away. And that's what you're doing with a trade like this. You mentioned that whole group of players. You could probably get a third round pick for most of those guys in straight up right now. And that alone, to do it for one, you just had a 4 shot of lost value right there. If you can chase a larger quantity of assets, do it that equates to the quality that you wanted originally. I'm all about it, but that's just not always the case. In that case, just be patient. Don't just sell to sell. Somebody at some point is going to be desperate enough. They're going to lose their running back. There's going to be an injury scare, whatever the case is. The situation will arise where the opportune time to sell is. You just got to be the guy with the guy on your roster at that time, if you have them, if you end up with them. Moving on into the last point I have for us today, Zach. I'm talking about allocating each asset you're willing to move the best way possible. There's going to be times where you have just pieces you're willing to move. That the strategy is simple. You're going to have pieces that you're willing to move. You want to move your late first round pick to better your wide receiver core, whatever the case is, just for an example. Make sure you're moving that first for the best asset possible. You are going to have plenty of suitors for that first round pick. There's going to be ones that are good. There's going to be ones that are less good. You got to sort out which one is best for you. We talked about it going into last season. Ezekiel Elliott was still worth a late first round pick. So was Austin Eckler. And we talked about it, hammered it all the way into the end of the regular season. Why spend a first round pick on Ezekiel Elliott when you could spend that first round pick on Austin Eckler? Even if we thought Ezekiel Elliott was going to do well, it was just silly to expect that Austin Eckler would do worse when their values were so similar, especially going into a season where we just weren't sure about Austin Eckler yet. So it's just one of those examples. The thing I want to do here too is kind of rewire the brain, because too often I think we just say, I want that guy. That's the guy I want. We're walking down the street. We look in the window, walking down the street in the store, and we say, I want that guy. And instead of that, we say, hey, I want that player. What will it cost? We go look at the sticker tag. Oh, that's a lot. I don't have that to spend. Instead of that, consider thinking, hey, I'm willing to move this asset. What can I get for it? I have $5. What can I go buy for $5? And this can kind of just put you in the right vein of where you should be looking, since these are the assets you're willing to move anyway. This is what you can afford for those assets, so on and so forth. You can and should operate in both mindsets where, we do just look out and see, hey, I want to go buy this more attractive player, whatever the case is, this more valuable player, this Travis Etienne versus a Brian Robinson, which I can actually afford. You know what I'm saying? But operating in both mindsets can provide a different method of how to get from the asset you have to the one you'd rather have, and ultimately the best one you can get in this situation. Like I said, ask yourself at the end of the day, I want this player, but is this the best player I can get when giving up this asset or group of assets that I'm moving for this player? Once that trade is in your inbox, think of it as, man, if I was moving these players, could I also get X more expensive player, or X better player? If you can, go shoot out that offer. If you're willing to make the deal in the first place, go look for the better player, or a better player that could fit what you have going on. Don't settle for a Kenneth Walker when you could rather maybe have a Travis Etienne, kind of a thing. If you're sending the same trade, you might be able to get one over the other. just something to think about. The thing to really think about here is once you move that asset, it's important to note that asset is spent. It's not coming back. You can't move them again. So make the assets you're moving count and make sure you're moving them for the best asset possible. Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts here if you have any.
I think the only thing I have to add here, Bob, is this is again where, and I know I've talked about this twice already, but just being able to walk away sometimes,
Sure.
being able to walk away from a deal, because this is like a total culmination of everything we've talked about, right? You're talking about allocating each asset that you're willing to move the best way possible, but that doesn't mean you just accept any deal, right?
Right.
Sometimes you got to wait for that best offer to make its way to you. And so I like this point because it kind of puts a bow on everything that we've talked about thus far in terms of wrapping it all together. Like, hey, listen, you got to know which direction you're going. You got to know which pieces you either want to move or you want to acquire, right? You don't want to accept less than what you're asking for, and you don't want to trade more than what you want to offer. So sometimes you have to be okay with just saying, this is not going to work out. Maybe we come back to this next week. So I agree with this point. I like this point. And it's a way to kind of put everything we've said together with a nice little bow on it.
Some of the best trades I've ever made are the ones that never went through.
100%.
That never got done at the end of the day, whether it was, I ended up being on the bad side of it, or even some trades were like, man, I really wish I would have made that trade a year down the road. It happens. But at the end of the day, there are plenty of times where I've looked back on trade offers that I've had the opportunity to accept. I didn't. And by God, I'm glad I didn't in the moment. So that's just something to think about. There's been some I've missed on, but there's been a lot too, like you said, where I've walked away from the table when we were close. And I just said, whether it was a gut thing, whether it was just looking at everything, it didn't make sense for my team in the moment, whatever it was. Like I said, some of the best trades I've ever made weren't ever completed. But if you want to make some of the amazing trades that we have to offer on this channel, be sure to subscribe. Check out our moves to make videos every single week and other strategy videos that we discuss on the channel for sure. And if you just want to be a better trader right now, hit that like button, comment down below what strategies you implement in your Dynasty leagues for trading. Talk about some of the trades we talked or the strategies we talked about today. Let us know which ones were your favorites. Some you may have already known. What did you learn today? Help out the community in the comments below. Let us know what strategies you're working with. We'd love to hear how you leverage trades and things of that sort. Head on over to the patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind Discord server. Get over there, get in that community, get engaged in some community. Having the community helps a bunch in trying to get deals done. But with that said, that is going to be it for me and Zach today. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.